It's January the 13th, and if there was any residue left of Christmas, it's definitely going to be gone by this evening. In the Orthodox Church, as far as I know, they have a festival on this particular day, which is the bidding farewell to the Nativity Feast. It's the kind of final closure on it, and it does remind me of that which the people used to do in Ireland many years ago on the 6th of January, which was to light candles in every room in the house in order to bid farewell to the festival. So we're really finished with Christmas, I suppose, at this stage. And I'm here a bit wrecked from the Christmas, I have to say, because there's a certain amount of overactivity. I'll put it no more clearly, but a certain amount of overactivity that leaves you a bit wrecked in January. And sometimes I think that, do you know the way you can get depressed in January and people can get worn out in January? The 3 weeks of January can be very difficult. But sometimes it's because you're exhausted from the Christmas. So what I plan to do today is keep things very, very orderly and read a section from Staring at Lakes. And it's the section about Mumbai in November 1998. I flew to Mumbai, squashed in with lots of Indians from London who jumped up when the British Airways flight was landing and created such a ruckus trying to get their luggage from the overhead closets and be first off the plane that the air hostesses had to shout at the top of their voices for everyone to sit down in case the movement would affect the landing. I had been able to fund the trip by doing some work on an Indian movie. In exchange for writing some script, they gave me an apartment on the north of the city for a few weeks and enough money to fly my beloved out as well. She arrived when I had the work done, about 4 weeks later. It was all so astonishing, so miraculous. We were in India. I saw it as a sign. We were being blessed. Some wonderful thing was happening to us. The gods were looking after us. The truth is that I was still in the grip of magical thinking, just as I had presumed on the day of my ordination, and just as I had presumed when I first took refuge in the serene quietude of a Tibetan Buddhist center, that the universe was revolving around me, and that the gods were intervening in a multitude of quirky ways to help me along the road of life. So now I also supposed that me and my beloved were conjoined with the blessing of some invisible being. Our lives were being entwined with a grace that almost proved the existence of benign deity hidden behind the stars. When I met her at Mumbai airport, she was distressed because her luggage had gone to Saudi Arabia. I asked about the child, our child. Sophia was then 4 years old, and rather than take her to India and expose her to exotic diseases, we left her in the safe company of our neighbours, the Maguire family, who lived down the road, a house full of girls where Sophia was embraced like another sister. It doesn't matter about the luggage, I said. You can get new clothes. We're in India. If there was a god or Buddha, or some divine creature behind the veil of the cosmos, he didn't seem to have much interest in the wretched poor on the streets around us. But it felt like he was holding me in the palm of his hand. I was the one from all the billions on earth that he was keeping his eye on, and he was maneuvering objects in the universe as if they were chess pieces, so that the day went well just for little old me. And now my beloved had arrived. Things could be perfect. I'll stop there for a minute because I think it's a good point. You know, that one of the weaknesses of a prayer for life is you can get into magical thinking, whereby you suppose that the creator of the cosmos, the ground of being, the ultimate depth of existence that's expressing itself in the cosmos, and the cosmos is a very, very big place, and you begin to think that, it's kind of centered around me. So that if you develop this kind of relationship with your mentor deity, the Buddha or Jesus or whoever, and the relationship kind of gives you the sense that the pieces on the chessboard are being moved around because of you, to mind you, and something turns up, like you get the job, or a check comes in, or just, a good clean bill of health or something, and you feel like, oh, well, that's, thank you, God, you have done this for me. And do you see, there's an obvious danger in it where you start to kind of put yourself at the center, and you get this inflated notion that God, if there was a God, would be minding just you. And I say just you because, well, in India at that time it was very easy to see extraordinary poverty. But the same is true whether you're living in Britain or Ireland and California or Sweden or France. There are so many people who are so poor, so much in suffering all around, that even the notion of faith in a God is a kind of a presumption. And that's a good way to think about why many people don't believe in God. I shouldn't say many people, I should say most people. I should say that the trend that, the way we're going in our culture is towards a secular life, towards a secular world. But it's understandable because, as I say, the way we think about God, the way we presume that God would be moving around the chess pieces to suit us, is a real sense of being inflated. It's a kind of terrible delusion. It's a magical thinking that it's just not right. And I'm putting this out there now because obviously you'd say, well, now, Michael, I thought you had faith. And I do. But let's look at it as a journey from magical thinking to a deeper sense of faith. Right? So when I talk about using the mentor deity, be it as a Muhammad or Shiva or Jesus or whoever, an angel, Abraham, whoever, when I talk about the mentor deity, I mean the one that you would put at the center of your imaginal realm as kind of the God, and that maybe you would have a relationship, a sense of engagement, a feeling that there was a presence manifesting in your life that made you in communion with that God who loves you. So that's all just a kind of an activity that goes on in the brain, in the mind. But the question is, do you use it to put yourself at the center of that universe? Do you do it like, I'm believing in God because he's helping me, so, it's really egotistical? Or is there some other way that you can use a mentor deity as a lens to live a happy life, and at the same time not get bogged down in this big sense of ego? Okay, I'll come back to it, but let me just go back to where we were in the book in India. I'm saying that, there I was in India, things couldn't be more perfect. In the back of the taxi, we gushed with amazement at the colours of India, the ocean of human suffering, the miles and miles of shantytown on the route in from the airport, and the smell of 10,000 sewers, the sight of people getting out of sleeping bags and canvas tents, or crawling out from under sheets of corrugated iron to have their breakfast. Women with toothbrushes stumbling around the tap, men shitting on the railway tracks. No matter that the gods chose to ignore the suffering of children with bony stumps instead of hands, who stuck their noses to the glass of the taxi at every traffic lights. All that mattered was that God had chosen to ignore them all and pay me his full attention. And if there wasn't a God, then my individual reading of Buddhism suggested that the chess pieces in the cosmos were moving themselves magically in orchestrated patterns to my advantage. The taxi took us to Pali Naka, a curving street with grocery shops all squashed together on the north of the city. We got out and walked from there. The shopkeepers had white coats, and the walls and interiors were of dark wood with wall-to-wall drawers, all full of exotic spices. The counters were spread with baskets of dried fruits, black and wine and purple fruits, dried raisins. There was a shop selling delicate homemade Punjabi cakes, and outside the world was a huge bazaar. There were stalls on either side of the street, decked with fruit and vegetables and chickens in cages. There was a telephone shop and a queue of black and yellow taxis. There was a dairy selling fresh yogurt and a magazine stand selling second-hand copies of Time, Newsweek and India Today. I saw a statue of the crucified Jesus adorned with saffron paper flowers, which imbued the body of Christ with an erotic energy, a frilly, wild life that reminded me of images that used to surface in medieval times in the confessions of canonized nuns who starved their imaginations to sainthood in monastic cells. Isn't this just amazing? I said to my beloved. I'll stop there for a minute because there's two really interesting things when I look back on it. You know, the magazine stand that was selling second-hand copies of Time and Newsweek, and you would wonder, well, why were they selling them? And I remember asking somebody at the time, like I thought, this is crazy, sure. You know, it's 2-3 months ago or 6 months ago. So what's in that magazine that's relevant? And somebody explained to me very simply. They laughed and they said it's to learn English. To learn English and to read and to get on in the world. And I have to say then, I suspect there has been improvements in the middle class world in India since the time that we drove in from the airport to Pala Naka at that particular day. But the other thing that fascinates me is the image of Jesus. They had a Jesus crucifix on the street, but they had saffron flowers hanging around his neck and on his arms and so forth. And these were fresh flowers, but there was a sense that it had mixed with Indian culture, and it in some way it reminded me of Celtic crosses. In some way it reminded me that when the Jesus story, comes out of the Middle East, it's it's a story that embodies an insight into what it is to be human and what it is to be divine, or how did we understand God as as human, but it lands in different ways in different cultures. That's all. But that's a hugely interesting thing, as sometimes people who are religious miss that point. That it's almost like, do you know the way they say in Ireland, St. Patrick went around and he blessed the wells. So the well was there. So let me go on. Isn't this just amazing? I said to my beloved. Car horns honked aggressively behind us as we walked along the street, sweat pouring down our backs, but we didn't mind. My underpants were soaked with perspiration, but it didn't matter. I put my arm around the woman with the dark hair, and she said she was desperate for a change of clothes, so we found a sari shop, and she bought a sari of amber silk and walked back into the sunlight like a goddess adorned in glory. Such magnificent clothes, we thought, and all for a few rupees. You see my point again, that we go to these places and we get excited because the clothes are cheap, because the food is cheap, and we're thinking, oh, isn't this wonderful? You know, God has blessed us in this. So we're not exactly thinking about the person who's slaving away for 1 or 2 rupees per day to make the clothes. I'm always amazed at that, you know, how even the most enlightened people among us in the West will go to places far off, far away on an aeroplane, and then settle down to a holiday where everything is cheap, and it feels like a delight, exotic, wonderful. But what about the suffering of the people who are there? Anyway, let me go back to the text. We reached a leafy avenue where high walls and gates kept the rabble out, and boys in green security uniforms saluted us as we walked inside with 2 plastic bags of fruit. Cozy Home, that's what it was called. C-O-Z-I, Cozy Home. It was an elegant set of apartments in 2 blocks on its own grounds, surrounded by walls and gates and guarded at all times, so that those who lived within could enjoy peace and tranquility when they returned home in their Japanese jeeps at the end of a long working day in the city. A young boy in a uniform too big for him washed all the cars and jeeps with a hose every morning. There was an old woman slightly stooped who came to our apartment each day, swept the floors with her twig, washed the dishes, cleaned the toilets and the kitchens and the showers, and made more beds than a sailor could make from the sails of a ship. And the apartment was beautiful. There was a long lounge with sliding glass doors that opened onto a veranda. Below was a sandy tennis court and huge trees for shade, and in the near distance the Indian Ocean. The waves were turquoise each evening, as the sun, a gigantic ball of crimson, floated like a Chinese lantern just above the horizon. We held hands on the balcony. We made love on the floor. We slept without sheets and ate overripe fruit in the mornings. And after a glorious week, the woman in the amber silk sari and me got the Bangalore Express. We were getting out of town. We were going on a pilgrimage. And I'll stop there. And again, when I'm reading back over it, when I'm looking at those images that come from over maybe just about 25 years ago, it's like extraordinary how, we didn't have the iPhone at that stage. We didn't have as much internet, as much technology. It's just extraordinary how we looked with amazement at the different culture and at the colour and at the wonders of the sun going down in the Indian Ocean. But at the same time, and by the way, like I was working for a film company, they were employing me, so I wasn't a tourist. I was working with Indian people. But yet, the disparity between my life and theirs was enormous. And even at that stage, 25 years ago, I didn't have much money. I was living from hand to mouth. If I got a couple of €1,000 for going out and doing a bit of a movie for 4 weeks, well, that might have to last me for 6 months when I came home, and you were still looking after the child and stuff like that. So I wasn't coming from an affluent background. But I suppose in some way, my culture was like a cushion underneath me. And I had that affluence in comparison to the helplessness of the people that you were meeting. I mean, that woman who used to come, she was just one example of somebody. I don't know anything about her except that she wasn't a young woman, and she would come and open the door. She had her own key. She was employed by the company that ran the apartments, and she would go around that apartment, and she was working hard for whatever few pennies she was getting. And I remember you could look out on a tennis court. I think I mentioned it there. You could look out on a tennis court, but in fact, there was even a family at the edge of the tennis court living in a galvanized hut. And they seemed to have a lot to do again in the apartment. So they were getting a job, if you like. They were employed. But their employment meant everybody in the family was employed. The man was working, the woman was working. I think the children were working. And the woman had 2 saris, and she would wash one in a bucket each day, each evening. And then in the morning she would stretch that sari like a single long piece of cloth, and she would stretch it on the side of the tennis court. And she'd wear the other sari. And the following day, she would do exactly the same, switching from one sari to another, day in, day out. And that was the simplicity of her clothes. That was the simplicity of her life. And we were up in a big fancy apartment, and we're looking down, and that's the way it is. And that's the way India is. So we got on a train, and it was the Bangalore Express. We were heading to try and, make contact with the Tibetan monastery down in an area which was a Tibetan colony in the south of India. It took us 17 hours by train to arrive in Hubli station. On our way to the monastery they had told me about in Jampaling. Outside the station there was a small group of beggars, skeletal brown figures in cheap white shorts, slithering around us like fish. We were the only Europeans on the platform, and we decided not to offer any money in case it caused a riot. Little motorcycles with rear ends like old-fashioned prams lined the pavement down along the sloping street around the corner. It was a warm evening. There was an orange glow from the sun. The clutter and the noise of the busy town filled the air. I couldn't hear my own voice above the din of honking cars and children screaming in the dust. We found a taxi, a big white taxi, and dropped into the huge red leather interior like film stars. It was hot and stuffy and silent. The windows were closed, and like a lord and his lady wife, we stared at India through the glass. The loneliness I had felt in the years we had been together seemed to be dissolving in the heat. All about me, the world groaned in terrible poverty, but behind the glass window of the big white taxi, I had the perverse feeling that the universe was singing with me and with us. And let me just refer to something in that paragraph. Do you know the loneliness I had felt in the years we had been together? That's a reference to something that I put into Staring at Lakes, which is the loneliness that you can experience sometimes in a relationship or in a marriage. And it's one of the most difficult. It's one of the most painful conditions of loneliness. Because if you're lonely in the house on your own or in a cave on your own, it's not as intense as to be lonely with somebody else. And when I go back to this period of 25 years ago, I didn't understand what the loneliness was. And in some sense, my whole life has been trying to figure out that loneliness. You know, it came to me as a child, so as a child I was lonely. I was a solitary boy in secondary school. I didn't engage in many sports. I spent time writing poetry and writing other little stories. That's what I loved to do, to be alone and to write and to tell stories. And the loneliness was inside me when I was a young teacher, and it drew me into the Christian priesthood because I thought, well, maybe that's, if you have this burden inside you, this loneliness, then maybe that's where you kind of land it. Maybe it'll all make sense. It's a kind of a aloneness that draws you into a deeper relationship with what you might call God. And that was the way I figured it out. And the minute I did it, like the day I did it, I realized at an institutional level, this is not for me at all. And so 10 years later, I'm a married man and I'm looking out the window of a train in India, watching the world pass me by, watching India fly by. And so I'm still lonely. And Buddhist practice was bringing me into a state of kind of calm abiding, but I never figured out that loneliness. And magical thinking is what you get. So that, in other words, loneliness drives you sometimes into religion. Loneliness is what haunts you. It like chases you, like something you're afraid of, something you don't want to sit down with this thing, but it moves you more and more towards a religious space, whatever the religion. And then in that space, you think for a while, because I'm religious, that'll solve everything. God will help me. And then very quickly you begin to realize that, the idea that God would be helping you and letting the children die on the street and letting swarms of people live homelessly with little tents, trying to get a little bit of water in the morning to brush their teeth, all together queuing for the one tap beside the railway station. The idea that God is letting that happen while he's minding me becomes in itself a terribly inflated sense of ego, a terrible sense of magical thinking. it's the key to me. It's the key problem with faith is the sense that in comparison to others, how could I even dare to think there is such a thing as a God? This is a big problem. It's the conundrum I really think is underneath modernity. It's underneath the whole way that Western culture has awakened to a sense of alienation from God, a sense that God is dead, or whatever way you want to put it, and created the sort of secular world we live in. Everybody doing their best to be more caring to each other and to actually get away from the idea of God. And it seems really, really plausible. It seems like a less egotistical, a less arrogant position than for somebody to say, well, I believe in God, he helps me all day. And then, well, what about the poor people? Yeah, well, he just mustn't be helping them. It's like, you can't leave it like that. And I know that many of you will say immediately, well, I'm not thinking of that hugely compassionate imperative within Christianity that comes from the Gospels. And I agree with that. That's something that I'll come to later. But I think it's just really worth sometimes reflecting, for me anyway, I reflect on the way that my faith is. The way that it started in loneliness. And maybe that loneliness is something that's never resolved either. And it goes towards a sense of affirmation of God that is offensive. It would be offensive to me if I was on the receiving end of it. If I was the person standing outside the door, begging and poor and hungry and desperate, and I was looking in the window at somebody who was well-fed, happy, and having a great time travelling around India and thinking, oh, God is looking after me, I'd say, what kind of person are you? And I'll tell you what this makes me kind of think about and come to terms with. Do you know this phrase that they have nowadays of white privilege? White privilege in relation to the oppression that sort of Western cultures visited on other cultures in Africa and Asia and South America and North America. White privilege is a real term going around at the moment, and you'd be sometimes wanting to reject it. You'd be feeling offended by it. Like, I might think, I'm not rich, I've struggled all my life, and you're telling me that I'm privileged compared to somebody from an African country who's a millionaire. That kind of... So white privilege is a tricky subject, and it's also one of those woke concepts which are so fashionable that people turn against the idea simply because it's fashionable. But I'd definitely like to say in this context, when I read back on that, I can see how there's a terrible disparity between the white man floating around in the train from one end of India to the other and the extreme poverty that is all around. And there has to be this sense that my culture has been a fortunate place for me to be born, rather than to be born on the side of the road beside the railway station in Mumbai. But where it really affects me is when you get into the idea of faith and religion. Because if I talk about God and I'm saying, God has blessed me, I was saying in last week's podcast, I was talking about how there is nothing but God, and I was so happy and emotional and excited about, the end of Christmas. It was the most beautiful Christmas, and everything was lovely, and I was talking about like that there is nothing but God, blah de blah. It's lovely, yeah, and I believe that, and I'll come back to it in a minute, or in an hour. I'm joking, but there's a danger in this whole idea of faith that not only is there a reality of my white privilege when I'm driving around, or when I'm being driven around on the train in India, that it's clear I have privilege. It's clear that where I was born and the health services I had and the food I had and the education I had is so far beyond what some little child on the street in Mumbai has. So different from it that you have to start taking into account the fact that the structures, the social structures of colonialism that were there allowed me, as white and Irish, to have more advantages, like radically more advantages. And those structures grew out of human ambition. They didn't grow out of the weather. They didn't grow out of like accidental tsunamis or something. They grew out of human ambition. Now that's white privilege, but what I'm saying in the whole of this reflection on India, when I was in India, to say I am blessed, if I'm saying it at a level of magical thinking, like God is looking after me today, it is so difficult to equate that with the reality that He's not looking after somebody else. And it is a real challenge to faith. And I think it's a real challenge to Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Islamic faith. And there's different ways that different cultures, different religions, sort of, set aside ways to be compassionate and to make compassion an imperative. Unless you have been reconciled with your brother, leave your gift at the altar and go and be reconciled. Now, we usually read that as if it means I've had a row with my brother, so go and heal the row and then say your prayers. But in some sense, if your brother is poor, if your brother in Africa or in India is starving to death, then there is a fracture in the relationship between you and him. And if that relationship in some way reflects a systemic fracture, a kind of a way that systemically everybody in his culture ends up broken, and in your culture you're eating popcorn and watching television. So that kind of disparity culturally, systemically, is a fracture in the relationship. And you can read the Christian text like that as well. If you have that disparity with your brother, go and fix it and then talk to God. Because the God thing can become magical thinking. And I feel that the one point that makes it different is that it's not always magical thinking. And I think the big issue in this podcast for me would be to try and struggle with the idea of how can I experience faith? How can I experience peace and serenity from my faith? How can I pray and feel that God cherishes me? How can I do all that without turning it into the idea that God is doing great things for me even though he's not doing much for somebody else. It's a big question, isn't it? I'll get back to the text here, and then I'll finish off the text. And in the next podcast, I'll come back to these ideas. The loneliness I had felt in the years we had been together seemed to be dissolving in the heat. All about me, the world groaned in terrible poverty. But behind the glass window of the big white taxi, I had the perverse feeling that the universe was singing with me and with us. As dusk settled on the streets and the vendors and promenaders haggled with each other, men stood around shop doors in groups after their day's work and watched the passing white taxis, the horn honking as it negotiated the narrow passageways, and the Europeans stared out in wonder. We arrived in Lama Camp 2 late that night. Monks carried our cases and asked for news from Ireland. How was their teacher? Was he in good health? They had been expecting us because he had telephoned earlier to say we would be arriving that night. We were their honoured guests because we'd come from Ireland as ambassadors of the teacher. We were brought to a square 2-story building with single rooms which housed 108 monks. There was a prayer room on the upper floor and one toilet on the ground floor. The cement walls were not painted, mattresses lined the floors, and 3 monks were squashed into each room. In the entire campus, which constituted 3 separate monasteries, there was a population of almost 3,000 monks, and in the evenings hundreds of them strolled along the dusty roads that stretched through the vast meadows between the individual monasteries. They talked of dairy cows and milk. They showed us fields of lush grass and explained that they had brought the grass on trains from other parts of India. They wanted rich fields to feed cattle, and they tried numerous times to reseed the land, but it didn't work. So they literally recovered acres with turf that they had brought across India by train. They apologized for the toilets, which were in a rough condition. They said they were hoping to build a new hostel soon, with Western standard toilets. Many of the young monks had TB and seemed gaunt and weak. Others were stout and robust and surrounded us from the time we woke until we went to bed at night. In the prayer room each morning, I sat with them as they chanted their prayers. I was overwhelmed. I cried. I hugged my beloved. Everything was wonderful. The blaze of sunshine, the prayer halls, the libraries, the prayer flags flapping on every building. So, I'm going to leave it at there for now because I suppose I've just described the journey of how Mumbai appeared to me, and then the train journey, and we're beginning to enter into an experience of closeness with the Tibetan monks. And I like to reflect on it, and to reflect particularly and challenge myself about that very idea of white privilege, about the idea of magical thinking, that you can just presume in your quiet little relationship with God that he's minding you, that you're being minded, and that in some sense He's arranging the chess pieces. Things fit in during the day and you feel very comfortable and you think, oh, God is looking after me today. Obviously, that's a surface way to experience faith. It's very likely that you're way ahead of me here. Let me say to you, I feel your presence suddenly. I feel your presence because I know, of course, that many of you are so far ahead of this. I'm a superficial person, I've always said it, and I don't know that much. But I knew that loneliness was the core issue in my whole life that was driving me towards religious faith. That's one thing. And the second thing is, I knew always that the sense of magical thinking and the arrogance and the presumption that God might be looking after me and not you was a very shaky ground to build a sense of faith or prayer. So the thing is, how do I get rid of that? How do I get rid of the magical thinking, the sense that I'm special, that in some sense I'm the one that God is minding in all the millions of years of history, all the millions of species, think of all the suffering of animals in evolution. Millions of years. We forget the suffering that was there in history, and not just in human history, but the way an animal suffers. I mean, animals fight each other, and one is very badly damaged, all sorts of ways. So there's a huge amount of things outside me. And if I'm ever going to have a good, strong foundation to my idea of faith, then I have to face up to those questions. And I think climate change comes into that as well, because climate change creates enormous suffering. And I don't even want to talk about Ukraine and the kind of suffering that's going on there, and the suffering that's going on in the Yemen. And I'm not saying these things to depress you or to make you feel down. I'm saying them because I sense that you may have a stronger faith than me. You may have a deep sense of faith that you can acknowledge in yourself when you hear the way that I am offering myself self-criticism. This is a self-critique, if you like. This whole podcast is me critiquing myself in relation to the way I think. I think sometimes I fall into magical thinking. I get that sense of, exceptionalism, the sense that, we can talk about God and God being everywhere and God being present and being the ground of being and how beautiful the liturgies of the Christian Orthodox faith are and all the rest of it, and yet nesting inside that is one single dangerous idea, and that is there is a God of intervention. There is a God that is in relationship with what is created, and I'm the one he's talking to. And I'm doing real well. So that leads me to think about these phrases like white privilege and check myself out on that. It leads me to ask questions about the nature of how I believe and why I believe. And I hope to come to that in the very next podcast. And I'm always afraid of saying that because sometimes I get a new idea and I want to share a new idea with you. But hopefully I'll come back to this. And thank you for joining me in the little trip through India. I hope it's been okay for you to think about those things. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.